So we're discussing about history of deep learning. So putting a pause to history of deep learning, whatever things we have studied in history of deep learning, we'll first do a mathematical and a comprehensive treatment of those. So we'll see, are there some computational models that were made by computational people, and how were they made, and how much effective they are, and are there some other lines of work which were done. Okay, so the first thing we saw is a neuron. Okay, because we had a reticular theory, and then we have neuron doctrine. So finally, by using electron microscopy, we could somehow ascertain that there is this neuron. So at the heart of this deep learning, or at the heart of these neural networks, lies this most fundamental unit. So this is called a neuron. So this is the fundamental unit of computation. Again, why do we call it a neuron? Because we wanted to mimic the brain, and the inspirations comes from biology. So what are biological neurons? Okay, so a biological neuron is also called a nerve cell. Okay, and they are the building blocks of brain and our nervous system. So each neuron, if you see, so they transmit the information through these chemical and electrical signals. So what is a biological neuron? So I'll just make a rough diagram maybe. So in biological neuron, you will have something of this sort. Okay, and then something of this sort. Okay, I'll pull up an image also, but what it is that it has 4 important components. So one thing is, I'll give a very simplistic explanation. If any biologist is watching it, and I know that biologists do watch it, so I'm sorry if I give some wrong explanation. So we have dendrites. Okay, so we have 4, as I said, 4 important things: dendrites, then we have cell body, which is also called as soma, and then we have axon. Okay, and then we have synaptic terminals, which are called axon terminals. And these are also called as synaptic terminals. And we have synapses. Okay, these are the important components in here. So the first is dendrite, then we have a cell body or soma, then we have axon, and we have axon terminals and the synapse. So here I'd like to pull up an image. Give me a. So if you see it over here, so this is the neuron. So this over here is the neuron. So as I told you, there are 4-5 important parts. The one is dendrites, one is dendrite, then we have cell body or soma, then we have axon terminal, and synapses. Rather, we have 5 important parts. These are the 5 important parts. So if you see, these are the dendrites. So neuron roughly looks like this. So as we earlier saw that there are a lot of different types of neurons. So this is one of the simplistic neuron, but that we have shown in the screen over here. So this is the neuron. So here these are the dendrites, and then this is the cell body over here. Okay, this is nucleus, and this thing over here, this long thing that is extending from here to here, so this is called an axon. And then we have this axon terminals. Okay, or the first thing is, what are these dendrites? So these dendrites, they are branch like structures. So if you see, these are like branches. Okay, these are branch like structures, so they receive the signal. So because when we see, because neuron, if you see, the reticular theory was saying it's a network of it's a single network, but then we found that there are discrete units which we call as neurons. So in that network of these neurons, so you have these neurons which are interconnected. So now these branch like structures, they receive signals from other neurons. Okay, so they act as an input to the neurons. So I can say this acts as an input to neurons, because somehow we should get an input from maybe the neurons which are in the network, which are maybe, let's suppose, coming before it. So we should get some input. So these dendrites receive those inputs. So they receive these signals, and input is sort of a signal. Then you have this cell body over here. If you see this cell body, so this cell body, so this is the part which processes the incoming signal. So this processes incoming signal. So it processes incoming signals. Okay, so this cell body is the part which processes the signals, and it also houses the nucleus. As you clearly saw in this the diagram, it's visible that it also houses this nucleus within it. Okay, so it somehow integrates all the incoming information. So how is information defined in biology? I'm not too sure about, neither are biologists, I think. And but there are some theories which have been given. Okay, how does it conduct information? As we have already seen that there is some chemical and electrical transmission that's happening. So we can delve deeper into this, but it will take a separate course to understand this. But I'm here for the sake of completion, for the sake of understanding how we make a computational counterpart of it. So we'll just maybe skim through it, maybe gloss through it. And then you see this axon. If you see this over here, so this axon, this is like a long cable like structure. Okay, so it extends this, and this actually transmits these electrical impulses. So this axon, if you see, so it transmits electrical impulses, transmits electrical impulses. Okay, so this is that cable-like structure. Okay, and this takes it from cell body towards the other neurons or other muscles. So each neuron usually has this one axon. Okay, so which can branch into many axon terminals. So if you see, there are then axon terminals are there. So it branches. So you have dendrite, it's a tree-like structure, and then within that you have the cell body. Cell body has a nucleus, it houses the nucleus. Then you have this axon. So axon, it starts with this cell body, and it then sort of terminates in those different axon terminals. So these are the axon terminals. So they are the endpoints of these axons. So if you see it over here, so these are the endpoints of this axon. So signal is passed to other neurons also via this. So via axon terminals. So this is wire pass, and usually through the chemical messenger. So here, so chemical process happening. As I said, it's an electrochemical process. So you're also having electrical signals. You're also having chemical signals. So through chemicals. So here the signal is passed from one neuron to the other neuron. So one to other. So one to other neuron, usually through what? Usually through chemical messengers. And then you have the synapse. Okay, synapse is the gap between neurons. So, okay, when you, if you see this neuron, then you will have the other neuron. So there will be a gap in between. Okay, so it's called a synaptic cleft. The gap between the axon terminal of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. So this is called a synapse. So this is not a part of neuron though. So this is the gap between these two neurons. Okay, so this site is the communication of between neurons. So this is the site bit of communication. Site of communication. So now we saw these important parts. Oops, I'll just move it over here. The first thing that we saw is a dendrite. So what are dendrites then? They are these branch-like structures which receive the signal from other neurons. And then you saw the cell body or soma, or it houses the nucleus. So what it does is, this is the part of the neuron which processes the incoming information or incoming signals. Okay, it integrates all information. As I said, that we don't understand very well enough that how information is stored in our brains. And then we have this axon. So this axon over here, so this is the axon, so which extends from the cell body towards these axon terminals. It's a long cable-like structure. It extends and it transmits electrical impulses away from the cell body towards the other neurons. Okay, and as I said, each neuron usually have one of this axon, so it branches into multiple axon terminals. Then you have these axon terminals. So they are the endpoints where signals are passed from passed to other neurons. Okay, usually through the chemical transmission. So if you see, so the axon usually has this axon over here. It does. Oops, this axon, it does the electrical transmission, and here via these axon terminals you have this chemical transmission. Then you have the synapse or synaptic cleft. So synapse basically is the gap between two neurons. So when you have this network of neurons, so in that one neuron is connected to other neurons, but there's a gap in between in one neuron, neuron A and neuron B. So that gap in between is called as synapse. Okay, this is the simplest explanation of a biological neuron. Any questions on biological neuron? So now you understand a bit about how biological neurons are. Okay, and as I said, disclaimer is, this can be totally wrong. I don't know much about biology, but this is the general structure. Now the question was, if you have a fundamental unit of this computation, can we come up with the counterpart? Can we somehow have a computational analogy? So now we wanted computational analogy. But an analogous that we can do is computation, and we came up with what's called as artificial neuron. This is what we came up with. So to mimic this behavior of biological neurons in machines, so this is what researchers came up with, the artificial neuron. Okay, so artificial neuron, and now it's today, as you know, that it's known as perceptron now, perceptron. So it later on changed this. Okay, so what is the structure of this? So if you see, I'll make a structure over here. Okay, then what I'll do is I'll create, let's suppose, two halves of this. So here I'll write, let's suppose, some F, and I'll write some G, and here I'll create these input signals. Okay, and here I'll create an output. Okay, somehow of this sort. So I'm making a computational counterpart. So think it as a rediscovery. Think it that if you were present at the moment when the artificial neuron was not there, and you understood about neurons. So now you have to make a computational part of this. So whatever we know about neurons is they transmit information. They either fire, so by firing they mean they get activated, or they're not activated. Okay, they get some multiple inputs. So these are inputs. So we have to computationally and mathematically model it. So mathematically we'll make a picture, and then we'll see how to perform computation on this. So what we can do is we can call these inputs as x1, x2, x3, x4. So these inputs can come from multiple neurons which are which are preceding this neuron in that huge network. So consider this as part in that huge network, a unit. Okay, so coming up with this again. So what I'm saying is, if you have to come with a computational counterpart, and you have to come with a computation analogy, the first thing is we have to map this input. So this is the input, and then we said we have two functions. We have this f and we have this g. So g function is the aggregation. It somehow aggregates all of this input. Then f function is the activation function. So based on the aggregation, it will take a decision. So it will say, do I have to fire this neuron? Do I have to activate this neuron or not? Okay, so this is based on this and the function, and then you have this output firing of the neuron. Okay, I told this is like dendrites. Okay, and this processing f and g is like the cell body or soma, and then it transmits the information also, and this output is like these axon terminals. Okay, I hope this is clear till here. Now this was the first biological simplest neuron. So now the thing is, the first thing which we saw is McCulloch-Pitts neurons. So we'll see what these people did. So McCulloch-Pitts neuron, I'll read MP neurons. We have seen this in the history portion also. These two people came up with the neuron. So they came up with this neuron, McCulloch-Pitts neuron. So what they said in that neuron is, so now everything is somewhat binary. So they said, if you see this neuron, so they said we'll take input as binary. So these inputs will be taken binary. Okay, you will have a function, aggregation function, and then you will have some decision function, and then you will have an output. So the input function over here, so they'll all take binary values. So binary values, it basically means, is there something or not? Let's suppose if you want to take a decision, do you want to go to school? So you say, is my friend coming? So it's a Boolean value. Okay, is my friend coming? Is it hot? Is it hot outside? Something of this sort. So all of these values will be Boolean. So these values will be Boolean, and then we aggregate some of them. Then by aggregation here we can directly sum them up. We can sum up these values, and then here we have what's called as thresholding logic. Thresholding logic. So if it passes certain threshold, then I'll fire the neurons. So the output also will be binary. So this was the model that was given by the McCulloch and Pitts. So we had this McCulloch-Pitts neurons. So what they said is, you have input are all Boolean values, they're binary values, either true or false. So then aggregation function is just a summation function. Then we'll have a thresholding logic over there. So thresholding logic basically is, so you will just take a particular value. You'll say, if the value is let's suppose of this sort, so I'll have this. So this will be, then if that threshold is crossed, then we can give an output. We can say that the neuron is firing. Okay, so this was the, so if I write it mathematically, so mathematically it was like, call this as x1, x2 or something, x3 and so on. So I can say summation of these xi's. These are inputs. Okay, I goes from 1 to n, say these are n inputs. Okay, you have to sum them up. If they cross some threshold, if they are equal to some threshold, call this theta, so I'll fire the neuron. This is called firing. Otherwise the neuron will be inactive. Okay, this is the logic. So this theta here is called as threshold. Okay, if my neuron, if I got certain, let's suppose you have this, so you have three inputs, input x1, x2, x3. So what you can say is, you can say that I have, is it sunny outside? Okay, is my friend coming? Okay, is there an exam? So now what you can do is, if two of these conditions is meeting, if you have, you can have threshold of 2. So you can say if 2 among these things are having high value, then only this neuron will fire. Then only I can take a decision that I'll go to school or I'll go to college. Okay, so now you put this threshold as 2. Okay, otherwise you can say, if one threshold is high, so if only one of these threes is high, if it is sunny, if it is my exam, is my friend coming, if one of these is true, I can put I can have this output 1, basically I will go to college or I'll go to school. So this depends on this threshold, and it depends on you, how do you set this threshold. Now there are two things which they mentioned in the paper, McCulloch and Pitts. They said it can be inhibitory or excitatory. So these inputs can be inhibitory or excitatory. Give me a second. So we can have inhibitory or excitatory inputs. So what is the meaning of these inhibitory? So this inhibitory input means, so if that input is high, irrespective of what is happening, it will mask that. It will not let the neuron fire. So let's suppose you have x1, x2, x3 is the input. If temperature is quite high, okay, irrespective of if you have, or if you, let's suppose if you are fighting a fatal disease, so will you go to college? So this input, if it is high, God forbid, so now what will happen is this output will always be 0. So it is inhibiting, it is having the inhibitory action, irrespective of what other inputs are, it doesn't matter. So but if there is one thing, let's suppose you have a fatal disease, because of that you cannot go to school, or college, and the problem is other inputs, maybe your friend is going to school, you have exam, yeah, it is sunny outside, it doesn't matter. But if this input is high, So this output always will be low. You cannot activate the neuron. So this is called as inhibition. So here some of these are called some of these input signals are inhibitory signals. So you can inhibit the things, and some are excitatory inputs. Excitatory inputs are which will contribute towards this aggregation. So they'll somehow contribute. So inhibitory basically means which will make everything zero. So by that I mean if that is high, so neuron will never fire. Okay, and excitatory inputs means it will sort of contribute towards threshold. So if you have to reach certain threshold, so it will help you in reaching the threshold. So these are the two things that they said. They said that you have these functions. Now what is happening inside? So you have this g function. So initially you apply this f function, you have this aggregation function on this input x. Okay, and on top of that you apply this g. So this f of x, so this is aggregation. Okay, and this function over here is activation function or decision function. Activation or decision function. And this x is a vector of values. I'm just putting mathematical notation in place now. So this x is input value, so it's a set of values x1, x2 till xn. So this is inputs. So these are your inputs. Okay, and each xi belongs to either 0 or 1. Okay, and what is the thresholding logic? The logic basically tells you that sum these xi's up from I is equal to 1 to how many inputs there are, and if they are equal or greater than some threshold, then you will fire. Otherwise, so this is else. Okay, so this over here is the model that I'm telling you. So if you remember this, so you understand the McCulloch-Pitts neurons. So there are two functions. You have activation or activation and decision function. You have an aggregation function. You have an input which is vector maybe, which because you know a bit of algebra now. So this is a vector. So each of this value can be binary. It can be the 0 or 1. It's a Boolean value. Okay, and then if you aggregate it and you take a decision based on the aggregation, okay, this over here a decision function. So if it crosses a certain threshold, as I said, this is called thresholding logic. Okay, so if it, and then it will fire over here. One over here means it will fire, and 0 over here means not fire. So this was the McCulloch-Pitts neurons. Any questions on McCulloch-Pitts neurons? Okay, the question was why are they used somewhere. So just hold on for maybe 5 to 10 minutes so that I first clarify why do we get this deep learning from initially. So we now understood the computational counterpart neuron. So we saw the generic version and then we saw McCulloch-Pitts neurons. Okay, then we will see how was it used. So before that I'll tell you, so why was this deep learning? Why was it a natural idea then? Because if you see the brain, if you see our nervous system, you saw that it's a network of neurons. Okay, it was pretty clear that there is this network. So then we saw that from CNN, from that experiment which was done by Wiesel and Hubel. So there we saw that two important things were done. So there is some hierarchical computation is done. So by this I mean like features are computation. Okay, so in that what we observed is that these features are probably they are extracted in hierarchy. So in that I gave an example. Let's suppose if you have this word, if you see this digit 9 on the screen, so maybe your brain is initially extracting this information, then it's extracting this information, then it's extracting, then it's putting them all of them together. So the information that the extraction of information is happening in hierarchy. Okay, and probably there are different parts of brain which are responsible. That's what we saw from that Hubel and Wiesel's experiment. So now the first thing was we saw a network of neurons, and in network we saw hierarchy, we saw layers, or there are different layers of working. So that is where this deep concept of deep came into the picture, because we now know that there is a discrete neuron, and then we know it's a network of neurons. So now the question was how to make it compute. So from this idea we came to know, okay, we should do it in hierarchy. We should have layers of these neurons. Okay, so somehow we should have initially some layer of neurons which will do some, and then we should have other layers of information. We should have other layers of something. So each layer will have different representation. So here it will be a low level representation, then it will be some other representation, and then finally you will club some of this information together so as to do a task. So this was done by Hubel and Wiesel's experiment, which we also saw a video of in the previous lecture. So takeaway lesson is this. So deep learning actually came from that. From the reticular theory, we knew that we have this nervous system which is a net of neurons, and from neuron doctrine we know that now we have discrete units. And how was this happening? And this Hubel and Wiesel, they told us, okay, this is happening in hierarchy. You have information extract that is happening in hierarchy, and it's happening in different parts of the even in the visual cortex. Okay, it's happening in layers. So let's suppose when you see something. So there will be interconnection of neurons will be there, and neurons will be, so there will be a network of neurons laid down. So it will happen in hierarchy. So that's how we came up with the picture of this deep learning. So in the next class also I'll show you about maybe visual cortex system. So we'll maybe see a brief video of how visual cortex works. So you will see that the features are extracted one by one. It's not that let's suppose when you see somebody, it's not that you in one shot see the person. So probably you initially recognize nose, eyes, eyebrows, beard, and maybe ears and something, and then this level of information is transmitted to other neurons. So other neurons maybe put this information together, and then it takes some time for our visual system to sort of understand this, sort of understand the whole mechanism, or understand the whole human being. If you see, or an object, if you see an object, if you see this pen, so probably you don't just see this pen initially. So maybe your visual cortex system understands this color first. Okay, this color is golden color, and then it has a tip at the end. This is the length of that. So all this information processing is it happens in the hierarchical level. It happens in the different layers, and then it's also put together, and then we understand, okay, this is a pen. But it happens maybe within milliseconds or nanoseconds even, and that's why this transmission is quite fast, and we do not have any lag. And sometimes it is also laggy, because if something is very blurry, you cannot figure out. It takes you maybe a couple of seconds to identify that object till your brain processes all the information. So all in all, what I'm saying is here, the hierarchical computation is done. So that means we came up with this layer of network. So we should do it in the hierarchies. So this was the inspiration of deep learning. Okay, so this is where the deep learning came from. Now we have the neuron. Now we have to somehow come up with this concept of deep learning. So before going there, so we'll first see where was this used. So if you have this McCulloch-Pitts neurons, you have this aggregation function, you have the decision function or activation, then you have this thresholding logic. Okay, now what we can do is, so I'll show you the working of what it can be done. So if you see any computer, so if you have read about computer architecture, digital logic design, you know that whole of these computers, whatever they perform, it is done by digital gate. It's done by logic gates. Logic gates like AND, OR, NOT. So all of these gates are, and then we have these gates, and we perform computation based on these gates. Now if you have a neuron, so the first natural question was, if I have to use it for computation, so can I implement gates with it? Okay, so that was the question. Okay, fair enough. Fahad, is it fair enough? If I check it, if I check the computation, can this sort of neuron, can it do the logical operations? Can it do logical AND? Can it do logical OR? So if it is able to do that thing, probably we can do much more complex computation based on that. Fair enough? Okay, now let's see how can we implement this. How can we use this McCulloch-Pitts neurons to implement these AND or OR functions? So the question basically was, we have to do computation. So we have to do computation, and we understood that computation can be done by logic gates. And now we have a neuron. Okay, now we also know we can have a network of neurons. That will come maybe later. So first we'll see, by using this single neuron, can I somehow computationally model this AND? Let's start with AND, or maybe OR. We'll start with AND and OR, both. So now you know the truth table. So the input is x1, x2, x3, howsoever, because OR gate, they can take a lot of inputs. It's not restricted to only. They can take more than 2 inputs also. And then we have an output. Similarly in AND, x1, x2, and you have an output. Now let's suppose you have this input. You know that this input is binary. So McCulloch-Pitts neuron works on binary. So you have this binary input. This can be 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. Similarly, inputs here can be, this can be input. And you know, in OR gate, one of them should be high, then you get the high input. And here you have the 0. So this should be, both of them should be high. So now let's suppose you know the truth table. So these are truth tables of OR and AND gate. Okay. Now if you have to implement this, so what we can do is, so you have this neuron, you have this McCulloch-Pitts neurons. Okay. And then you have this aggregation function. You have 2 inputs, say x1 and x2, and then you have this output. So what we can do is, we can say, in order to, let's suppose for this OR gate, so we'll say the summation of xi. So we'll sum both of these things up. So if the threshold is greater or equal to 1, so you fire the neuron, otherwise 0. So here theta is equal to 1. So threshold and logic is equal to 1. So don't you think that if I put this threshold and logic equal to 1, so if I put 1 over here, this threshold and logic after the aggregation, so this will behave as an OR gate. So how many of you agree with this? So how many of you agree with this logic? So if I put this threshold over here equal to 1, so this thing over here will behave as an OR gate. Good. Okay. So now you tell me the next one. If I have to implement AND gate with this, okay. So I am getting input x1, I am getting input x2, and this is my output. So what should be the threshold? Anyone? So here I fire this neuron. This should be, in this case, it should be greater or equal to 2, okay, or exactly equal to 2 in this case. So, and the theta is equal to 2 then. So if it is 2, then we will fire it, otherwise it will. So this over here is the computational model of AND gate. So at least now we could sort of implement, we could implement OR gate, AND gate. We could also implement NOT gate, but in that NOT gate we should have inhibitory output. So in that we can have inhibitory output. So if this is high, so this will be 0 output, and then we can accordingly have threshold. So this is for the NOT gate. So because McCulloch-Pitts neuron also gave us inhibitory and excitatory input. So if this is high, so computationally we can keep it low, okay, and we can put a particular threshold. If the value over here is 1, so we can put the threshold. So now you could see that we can somehow simulate this. We can come up with the computational model of AND gate. We can come up with the computational model of OR gate. We can come with the computational model of NOT gate, maybe NOR gate also, and we can come up with a lot of gates. So can we make everything? The question was, can we come up with in every gate? Okay, the question the answer is no. You cannot do this. Okay, so in order to understand this question, the question is, can we model every logical gate? What I said is the answer is no, we cannot model. Okay, in order to understand this, so we'll first have to understand the geometrical meaning of this. Okay, we'll have to understand the geometrical meaning of these McCulloch-Pitts neurons. So what is the geometrical meaning? So who is following me till now? The geometrical meaning was this. Let's suppose you know that if I take this x, I'll take this, so I have values x1 and values x2. If I just restrict myself to only 2 inputs, say we are discussing say OR gate. Oh, let's suppose this OR gate is there. So we have this logic x1 plus x2. If this is equal to 1, okay, then I'll fire the neuron. So this will be fired that time. So summation of xi, even it is greater or equal to 1, doesn't matter. So this is equal to 1, so I'll fire, otherwise 0. So if I see it geometrically, so I'll make a coordinate system. So I'll see if I make a coordinate system of this sort. Okay, so I'll see the geometrical meaning. So here this value is 0, 0. Okay, this value over here is say 1, 0. This value over here is 0, 1, and this value over here is 1, 1. Okay, everybody is with me so far. Now what I'm saying is, if you see this, if I say x1 plus x2 is equal to 1, so this is a linear equation. Okay, call this x1. Okay, call this x2. This is x2. This is x1. So I have to satisfy this equation. So if I draw a line from here to here, so you see this. Okay, this line over here. Okay, so this line over here represents x1 plus x2 is equal to 1. How many of you understand this? That this line over here represents x1 plus x2 is equal to 1. Okay, because let's suppose you take this point. So this is 1 plus 0 is 1. You take this point, 1 plus 0 is 1. You take any point. Okay, let's suppose you take midpoint. So that will be 1/2 plus 1/2 is equal to 1. So this line over here represents x1 plus x2 is equal to 1. So but if you see this line, it does something interesting. So it separates, or it somehow divides this whole 2D plane into 2 portions. So one is this portion. Okay, one is this portion and other is this portion. Okay, so this here is called sometimes a decision boundary. Decision boundary, because it is used to take decision. So whatever you see above this, so whatever you see above in terms of OR gate, so this, the value is 1. Okay, the value is 1. So whatever is below this line, so the value is 0. So if you see this value, so this is red over here, so let me change this color to green so that I can show it with green. So these points, this point, maybe green will not be visible, I'll maybe show with some other color. This point over here, and this point over here, and this point over here. So this, for all these points, the neuron gets activated. And for this red point, the neuron does not fire. So you can clearly see that I can have a decision boundary. Okay, so what is so special about this AND gate, OR gate? And we can do the same treatment for, let's suppose, AND gate. So if we do the same thing for AND gate, so what is the threshold logic? The threshold logic is x1 plus x2, this should be equal to 2. Okay, this is the threshold logic. So when you draw this, so you will have something of this sort. You have 0, 0 over here, you have 1, 0, you have 0, 1, and you have 1, 1, 1, 1. Okay. Now what you can do is you can draw a line over here. So again this line. So the line that passes through this 1, 1. So what this line will tell you. So this line will again separate into two parts. So this will divide the whole plane into two parts. So one part that I mentioned over here, red. So this gets activated. Okay, it fires the neuron. So the other part over here, so this does not fire. So okay, so these are two different surfaces. So this is the decision boundary over here. Decision boundary. Okay, so now if you see this, so here you saw this clearly, we have decision boundary. Here again you saw we have a decision boundary. So these decision boundaries were what we call as these surfaces were, so they were linearly separable. Okay, so what was it? So they were linearly separable. So if you saw, we just drew a line, and we could separate the inputs from each other. So here all these inputs lying on the below side, these here were 1. Okay, sorry, here it was, I think in AND it was 0. Okay, all these were 0 and all these were 1 over here. So they were activated here and they were not activated. So still it was a linear decision boundary. So it was a linear, we could take a decision linearly. Similarly in the OR gate, if you see, same thing was here. So below this line, so we had a line which decision boundary x1 plus x2 is equal to 1. So this over here was not activated or 0, not fired. And similarly over on this side, you can see this gets activated. Okay, on the above side, you have this surface, whatever, if you have a linear surface, it divides the 2D surface, it divides this 2D surface, the linear line, it divides into two parts. So one was called as positive half space. So this is called as positive half space. And we have a negative half space. Negative half space. So what is positive half space? Where the output was 1, where the neuron was getting activated. And what was negative half space? Where the neuron was not getting activated. So but what we saw is that these things were modeled because the data or the input to output model, it was linearly separable. We could linearly separate them. How many of you understood this point geometrically? So now the homework I am giving you is, you see that you draw XOR function for yourself. Okay, then you see that in XOR function this is not linearly separable. You cannot linearly separate it. So then what is the problem? So this McCulloch-Pitts neurons, the modeling of neuron that we came up with, it won't be able to model this XOR function because XOR is not linearly separable. So all the things that it was doing is, it was only making a decision boundary where we had linearly separable things. So if your data is linearly separable, then we could have modeled it by using these McCulloch-Pitts neurons. Okay, and then came even this problem was with this neuron, with the McCulloch-Pitts neurons. We also have a different model. Now people thought, okay, there is a problem. Why should we only take Boolean inputs? Why not some other real valued inputs? Okay, the problem with McCulloch-Pitts neurons was it was only taking Boolean inputs. So why not real valued inputs? Real valued inputs. This was the first question. Second question was, why is it giving equal weightage to every input? So this is not the usual case that happens usually in day-to-day life. You give some inputs are given higher weight, some inputs should be given lesser weight. So why not different weights? Okay, these are the two problems that people thought is with McCulloch-Pitts neurons, because it was taking binary inputs. So usually all the values are not binary. You can have real valued inputs. And the second thing was, it was giving equal weightage to everything. Okay, let's suppose as I said, if you have to take a decision and you say, I have to take a decision, say, should I watch this movie? Should I watch it? If you're going to watch a particular movie, so then you see, is it from let's say a particular genre, and is it directed by somebody? Okay, and then how much is the rating or something of that sort? And maybe let's suppose if its rating is high, so you give more weightage to this. Okay, and you don't give equal weightage. Say you have more weightage to, say, if rating is above 8, so you will give some higher weight to this. So I'll assign a very high weight. If let's suppose director is not that much important to me, okay, I'll give lesser weight to it. So this was the question: why not to give different weights? Why to give equal weights? So then we came up with this perceptron. So in 1958, Frank Rosenblatt came up with this solution in 1958 that we saw in the history. We are still seeing the computational counterpart. So they came up with what is called as perceptron. Okay, so Frank Rosenblatt. This was Frank Rosenblatt. So this person came up with this perceptron. In order, the problem is which it had binary inputs were there. That was the first problem. Second problem was why not to have different weights? Because the real decisions that we take in real life, they are weighted decisions, because we pitch or we leverage one input like to some very high extent and other to some very low extent. And that one more problem was, why have this thresholding logic? Why to have threshold logic? Why thresholding? Why to have this hardcore thresholding? Okay, then it does not leave any room for learning. We cannot learn it if you have to learn something. So this threshold or hard coded values should not be there. Hard coded values, no hard coded values should be there. So at least we saw three problems. The first problem is, why only binary inputs? Okay. Second, why to only give same weights, or why to weigh everything equally? And the third problem was, why thresholding? So in order to answer these three questions, so natural idea was to come up with the perceptron. So what perceptron should do? So the first thing it should do is, it should have a real valued inputs. Okay, so x1, x2, x3, x4, so all of these should be real valued. So now this xi values, they should belong to real value. Okay, so this was the first problem was fixed. The second problem was, why not different weights? Why same weights? So everything was one. So we can give w1, we can give weights to these now, w2, w3, w4, and so on. So now we have these weights also. So weights also belong to some real numbers. So now when you have this aggregation function, you aggregate it like this. You see w1 x1 plus w2 x2 and so on till wn xn. You aggregate it like this. Okay, and in this, how I can write this equation? I can write summation of wi xi. I goes from 1 to n. Okay, this is my aggregation logic. Now I have to come up with threshold. Okay, the thing is, now the question is, why this hard coding threshold? So what we can do is, you can put a bias in here. Okay, let's call this x0. X0 is, sometimes you might be biased. Okay, biased towards something. So what you do is, you can put, let's suppose, some bias term over here. Okay, this bias term of x0, the x0 term, or I can call it b later on. So x0 term, this term will be inherently saying that this neuron is biased towards something. Let's suppose if you have a bias, if you want to go to college and you enjoy your college a lot, so you have a bias going towards college. So, and this should be greater or equal to some threshold. Okay, let's suppose this should be greater or equal to some 0. Even if you, some people write it like this also. They say this should be greater or equal to like threshold theta, and then they take it over here. So they say, you will see many of these formulations. So I goes from 1 to n, wi xi minus theta should be greater or equal to 0, and then they include this bias term. Then they say, okay, I'll put this bias. Why to put threshold? Just don't hard code it, just put it as bias term. I is equal, they'll say 0 to n, wi xi is greater than or equal to 0. How many of you understood this conversion? So here this was theta, I converted to x0. Okay, and then I said it starts from 0. Okay, starts from 0, and then xi, maybe I can put that initially as 1. So 1, that should be equal to 1. Yes, questions. Okay, yes, the question was like, if we put this theta is equal to x naught, then it should be weight associated. The w1 that you will consider, w naught, this w naught will be equal to 1. Okay, so that we just put this bias over here. Okay, so what is the meaning of bias? I just want you to know the meaning of bias. The meaning of bias is that it is inherently biased towards something. As I said, let's suppose you people enjoy college. So if you have to cross a certain threshold, you already have a certain I'll go to college anyway. So now all of these things will contribute towards the thresholding logic, but you already are biased towards going college. And so let's suppose somebody is just looking for excuses of not studying. So they have a very high bias of not studying. So if you give them a lot of inputs of studying, so but they have the bias. So that's where you get these biases from. So you get three things now. So we get inputs. Okay, and inputs are now real valued. So they have real valued inputs. And the second thing you got is weights. Weights is now you can weight them. And the third thing is bias. Okay, and you now understood bias. How many of you now understood these three terms? You have also, these are also real value, and bias is also real value. All of these things are real valued. They belong to real values. Inputs basically means the input that you get. Weights is how do you actually want to weigh them. And biases, do you have some inherently bias in this neuron? As I gave an example of, like somebody wants to go to college and they already love going college. They have a high bias of going to college. Somebody hates to go to college and they want to find an excuse of not going. Okay, they have a very high bias of not going. Okay, this is why this bias is for. So now you saw it that we had inputs, we had these weights, and we had these biases in this. Okay, so this is what is called as a perceptron. So perceptron, simply if I write it, this is wi xi, it's greater than or equal to 0. The I goes from 0 to, let's suppose n, so it will fire this time. okay, or it will not fire. This was called as perceptron. So we'll see how many problems did it solve. Okay, first thing is input is real value, it solved the problem. Okay, it was weighted now. It was not giving the uniform weight to everything. It was not giving weight 1 basically to everything. So it is also weighted. So you also added some bias. So now you don't have only threshold law, you have bias. But can it map XOR function? The question again is no. This also cannot map XOR function. Okay, and before going ahead, so why does it make? I'll also put again one more homework for you people. You again use this perceptron. You use this perceptron to map AND, OR, and other things, and then you also see why can't it map XOR. Okay, and then what we can do is we can predict. So from this, what we can do is we can then have a perceptron, what's called as perceptron learning algorithm. Perceptron learning algorithm. So we'll not hard code these values, we'll not hard code this W1, W2, W3, but we'll somehow learn these weights. But these weights will be learned from data, and this weights and biases, so these will be made learnable. So they'll be made learnable from data. So initially we're hard coding this, we're putting hard coded values, the weights were uniform 1, 1, 1, and we did not have bias. Then we're saying, okay, this is the threshold logic. Now what we can do is we can learn this from data, and then there is an algorithm which is called as perceptron learning algorithm. Okay, that we'll see. And before going here, so I'll just again reiterate. I'll give an example of, let's suppose you want to predict some college admission. Okay, I'll show you how this perceptron works. So say you have these 3 inputs. You have input x1, x2, x3. x1, x2, and x3 is the input. And x1 has high GPA. High or GPA. How much is the GPA? Because we take real values. And then how much research experience. Okay, and we can give some values to each paper. Okay, which school is it, from a top school, which school is this, and based on that we'll have to output should we admit the person into our college or not. Or let's suppose if we have to enroll students in our research group, so I'll say, okay, how much is the GPA in the undergrad? Okay, do they have some research experience, or which college are they from, okay. Then one more thing is there, so I'll put a bias term also, that is x0. So what is this bias? Basically this is how much scrutiny am I doing, how hard is it to get admission in my research group or in my college, how hard. So I'll put some bias over here. So this is the bias term. Okay, so what is bias? Basically, okay, I'm inherently biased towards something. So let's suppose if it is a tier 3 college, it's pretty easy to get admission. If it's, let's suppose, a tier 1 college, or maybe let's suppose if it is a highly competitive college where people want to go in bulk, so what will happen is, so this value will be it will be in such a way so that it inherently has bias of not taking people. So if it is a tier 3 college, people will like put this value such a way so that it's very easy to go there. So now this GPA, this research, people will give some weights to this. Let's suppose if they have research experience, give them more weight. So this will be assigned more weight. I'm just justifying like why was perceptron developed the way it was developed. Initially real valued, it is understandable. The second thing is weights. Why should we have these weights? Let's suppose more weight should be given to research. After this, maybe a little more to GPA. Then which college? Let's suppose. So this college, this should be given least weight, say least weight. But the highest weight should be given to research. Now it makes sense, and it can be inherently biased. Okay. So based on this, now we can say based on this, if we have this bias, say let's suppose this is theta or x naught, we directly take it x naught. So based on this, we can again make perceptron work. We can say that if it passes this greater than or equal to 0 threshold, so this is w1 plus w1 x1 plus w2 x2 plus w3 x3 plus x naught. Okay, if it's greater than or equal to 0 somehow, and this threshold over here, so you'll all have to put the values. So you can see that this weight can be given high. So research experience, so this is our research experience, so this weight will be high, so weight will be high. Okay, and maybe these will be given less weights, or relatively this will be given more weight and this will be given a little less weight. So this I can drop 2 maybe dots, and here I can give 1 dot, that means the weight is a little higher, weight is least, and here I can give 5 dots, weight is the highest among them. And this bias, it depends on how hard it is to get into this college, or how hard it is to get. So we can put, let's suppose it is inherently biased with 3. So now based on these numbers, I can see if it is greater than 0. If the value is greater than 0, then I'll admit the person into the college, otherwise I'll not. Okay, so this is how perceptron works. So but what I said is, now we can still hard code these, we can give w1, w2 some values in order to like make this problem work. But we, as I said, we will try to learn this algorithm. We'll try to learn these weights and biases from what? We'll try to learn it from data. We'll try to learn weights and biases from data. from data to get an output. Okay, because our output will be tuned, it will be based on these weights and biases. So we have two things. We have learnable parameters. So in our neuron, weights and biases are the learning parameters. We can learn weights and biases. So input is fixed. It also varies on a network. You can give multiple inputs, but once you have a certain problem, so you fix the input. So you assume the input to be fixed, and this is variable. So this is variable, or they're learnable, and this is fixed. And based on this, you have to predict output. Okay, and you have in between the learning will happen. So what is a learning? If you ask, what is a learning in machine learning? So in machine learning, you have to adjust these weights and biases. You have these knobs. You have to adjust these weights and biases. So what is learning in machine learning terms? So you saw deep learning. So we justify what is deep. So deep basically it's hierarchical. It has layers of computation, and it learn some intermediate representation, learn some low level representation in each layer. It's happening in hierarchy. Okay, and it's happening maybe in multiple it's happening at multiple nodes or multiple neurons at the same time. So that is what makes it deep. And second, what is learning then? So learning basically, if you see in the setting of neural network, it is basically to adjust these weights and biases, adjust in such a way so that you get the desired output. Okay, that's why we call it deep learning. So how it is learning? So it is adjusting its weights and biases. So okay, let's now delve deeper into this perceptron, and we'll see maybe the expressive power and what can we do or what cannot we do. And we again start with our OR function. Okay, we'll do some mathematical treatment because in the previous lectures we did some geometrical treatment. Now we'll see it mathematically what we want to actually do. So take this OR function. So we have OR function. You have the truth table x1, x2, and you have its output. So you have 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. Okay, and then you have this 0, 1, 1, and 1. Okay, so kind of this is your example. Okay, now you know that you have a perceptron of this sort, in which you will give, let's suppose, x1 and x2 as input. This will be w1 and w2, and then you have some output. Okay, maybe as bias we can also add bias. Let's suppose we have w0, and this will be that. And now if you see this, for this 0, 0, if we take the first input, if we take this 0, 0 input, so what is the meaning of this? So this means you have to take w0 plus w1 multiplied by 0 plus w2 multiplied by 0. Okay, you have to give both of these inputs 0 value. Okay, and then that thing should be less than equal, because here you don't want to fire it, you don't want to fire this. Okay, this should be less than 0. This is the first linear inequality we are getting. So these are called as inequations or inequalities, and this is the first input. If we take second input now, second input says w0 plus w1 dot 0 or multiplied by 0 plus w2 multiplied by 1, that's 1. So this is firing over here. So this should be greater or equal to 0. So this is for the first, this for second, and now similarly we can make third and fourth equations. So third and fourth will be w0 plus w1 and multiply by 1. Here we can also write multiply by 1 plus w2 multiplied by 0. This should also be greater than or equal to 0, because here also, if you see in the truth table, the neuron should fire at this point. Similarly, on the 4 we have w0 plus, then we have this w1 multiplied by 1 plus w2 multiplied by 1. This should also be greater than or equal to 0. So you have to solve these 4 inequations. Okay, you have to solve these. So you have to solve these. So in order to come up with the values for w0, w1, and w2. So this is a task that you have in the hand, because what we said is this x1 and x2. So these are our inputs. So this inputs, and usually the inputs are fixed, and the things that you can change are these weights and biases. So these w0, w1, w1, and w2. So these things are called as weights, and this is our bias. So this was our bias. Okay, these were the weights. These were learnable, and we had to somehow learn this. Okay, is it clear for everyone? So this is the setting so far. So we have 4 inequalities, so we have to solve them. So what we can do is, so there is a set of possible solutions that can be there. So okay, if we, let's suppose, give these values, if we hard code these values, say w can be given, let's suppose w0 can be given -1, so this can be given, let's suppose, 1.2, or this can be given 1.1 or something of that sort, and then you will see that these values, so these values are the values of that normal vector. So if you remember your linear algebra basics, so there we said that if you take an equation of this sort, w0 plus w1 x1 plus w2 x2, okay, is equal, let's suppose, is 0. So this is equation of a plane. Equation of a plane. Okay, and this, the weights W0, comma W1 and W2. W0, W1 and W2. So these are the weights which we call as normal vector. Okay, I hope that you remember this. So what I can do is I can just maybe show you some code and we'll plot this. Okay, give me a second or so. I'll show you some code to plot this. Okay, now what I'll do is I'll paste a snippet of code and then I'll explain it to you. Okay, basic code, nothing much. So what we'll do is, so now I'll open this VS Code. If you see this over here, so I'll change this to Python. Okay, so I'll go through this code. So if you see this standard imports, then this is the OR function. Okay, so I'm creating an array where I'm giving these inputs. So this is 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0 and 1, 1. So these are the inputs x1 and x2. And now you have this outputs for this. So you have x as inputs and you have these labels. Now I'm hard coding these values. I'm saying W0 is equal minus 1.2, W1 is equal 1.3 and W2 is equal 1.2, something of this sort. Okay, and then I'm plotting this. So I'm plotting these points and corresponding their labels, and I'm also plotting this line. So if you see this line, if you see this, so for I in range of 4, so I'm running this loop 4 times. So I'm saying when yi is equal 0, okay, so basically this is 0, so you plot this. Okay, you plot this basically red and have a marker there, basically plot that with red. And for other points which are having label 1, basically class 1, give them as blue labels. Okay, I'm plotting a scatter plot. Okay, for all these 4 points that we have. Okay, then this is the decision boundary that we have. Okay, decision boundary is W0 plus W1 x1 plus W2 x2 is equal to 0. So this is the line, equation of a line. Okay, this is y is equal to mx plus c sort of thing. Okay, now here if you calculate the values, I'm giving x values and I'm calculating y values based on these. Okay, pretty standard stuff. And then I'm plotting these things. Okay, and then I'll plot this perceptron. So if I now plot this, say this is the graph that I'll get. Okay, I hope that this is visible. So if you see this graph over here, so this point almost is on the line and this point is above the line and this point is also above the line. So you know now this data is linearly separable. So you can clearly see that if you see this point, so this point is the point that has class 0 and all the other points have class 1. That's here we have to make neuron not fire. So in all these 3 points we have to make sure that neuron fires. So we have solved this equation somehow and we gave the hard coded value. So what were the values? So if you again see the code, so the values that were given are these values. So these are the values. So W0 is equal to minus 1.2, W1 is equal to 1.3 and W2 is equal to 1.2. We can change the values because there are a lot of possible values for these. It's not just one line that can separate them. Okay, if you see the graph again, if you see this graph, so you can clearly see that it is not only one line that can separate them. So what we can do is we can have a line of this sort. So we can have a line like this also. It will still separate them. So here it will separate the positive points. So here there will be negative points. So this line will have its own W0, W1 and W2 values. Okay, so what are these values? So this is the value of that normal vector. So I can have a normal vector like this. So this vector over here, the vector that I am drawing right now. So this will be that normal vector to this line. Is it clear so far? Everybody following me? Then you geometrically saw and you mathematically saw that this is nothing but you have to solve these linear equations. Okay, you have to solve these linear equations. Now sometimes what you can do is you can make errors. Okay, let's suppose if you see this over here. So if you have drawn line like this, okay, then you would have made an error over here. Okay, you would have made an error for this point. So this would have been error. So out of these 4 points, you would have one error. Again, if we have drawn like line, let's suppose like this. Okay, say let's suppose like this. Now you will have error for this point. Let's suppose this is now positive. So this and this point will be considered now as negative. So for this, let's suppose it is correct, and for these 2 points it's wrong. So you'll have 2 errors. So now based on this W1 and W2, you will have the errors. Now your goal is to minimize that error. So if you now see, okay, if you now see, you give these values W0, W1 and W2. You are getting a line as an output of these things, and then you see, is it separating the points enough? If they are separable by this line, so you say the error is 0, and your task is to minimize that. Your task is to get almost 0 error in this case because it's perfectly linearly separable. So now you have a function. So your function is this. Initially your function is f of, you have a function in which you give this x as input and you have some fix. You try to adjust these weights, and based on these weights you get some output. You get some output labels. And now you get output of the labels based on these W. So there is another function which we'll call as error function. So this error function will take values as W0, W1 and W2. It will tell you how many errors. So it will give you what is the error. Okay. One function is the function that you are trying to learn, the line basically that you are trying to learn. The second function here over here is the function that will tell you how much good is your function. So this is giving me the estimate of how better is your approximation. Okay, I'll just remove this code. So this function is the approximating function. So this is approximating function. If you want to approximate something, so in this case, you wanted to model OR function, you want to model the OR gate by using a single neuron. So I said, okay, you give the X as input and then you have fixed your weights. You have W0, W1, W are fixed, and then it gives you output. Output will be 0 or 1. It's a classification. And now what would you have to do? You have to tell us, because you cannot always draw this line, because always you will not have only 2 inputs. You will have a let's suppose higher dimensional input sometime. So that then it becomes very hard to visualize. So that time what you will come up with? You will come up with an error function. So this error function will take your weights as input. It will take this W0, W1 and W2, the weights and bias as input, and it will tell you the error. It will compute the error. And your job usually is to minimize this. Okay, this is the error function that you have to minimize. So this is error function. So it tells you how better is your approximation. Okay, so what you can do is sometimes you can plot also. So in this case, let's suppose if W0 is fixed, if we fix our bias, okay, then we can plot this. We can plot W1 and W2 can be plotted. So this can be plotted, and on, let's suppose if we make this graph 3 dimensions, so here we can plot error also. So we can say based on this W1 and W2, so you'll get the error, and you will try to see, you'll try to sort of know that function and see, okay, we have to go to the local minima at least, so we should get the minimum error in that. So okay, I'll plot that as well. So if I again go to the code window, I'll plot that. And so this thing is called these curves, the curves that you will get over here, this W1 and W, you'll get some curve. Let's suppose you'll get a curve of this sort, or sometimes if it is just one variable, if it is W1 and then here you have this error, so you'll have a curve of this sort, let's suppose something of this sort. So these are called as error surfaces. Sometimes it's easy to visualize. You can visualize if you have 1 or 2 input variable, if you have just one parameter W0, or maybe let's say W1. In other cases, for 99% of the cases, you will have a lot of these parameters, then you will not plot it, but at least you should know it that these things can be plotted if we have very low dimension. If we have, let's suppose, W1 and W2 only, if we have W1 only, then it becomes like this. Here or here is 1D, so this becomes 2D. After that you cannot imagine. So I'll just plot it so that you understand these things quite well. So I'll plot this error surface. Okay, just give me a second. I'll again bring the code and I'll copy a snippet of code and I'll paste it, and pretty easy to decode. And when you see the lecture again, so when you see these lectures again, please pause the video when I'm showing the code so that you decode each line of the code. It's not difficult because we have done enough Python and enough Matplotlib. Now if you see this, so what I'll do is, so again same thing, we have this inputs and we have these targets, and we're keeping this threshold, that is bias is fixed, this W0 is somehow fixed. So now what we can do is we can plot this error function. So if you see, this is the error surface and you want to go somewhere over here, you want to see the minimum error, and there is a possibility you'll get 0 error. So 0 error is possible over here, and you see this is a step function also. This is not a continuous one, that's step function of some sort. So here you have this W1 and you have the W2, and on this you have the errors. Okay, you have number of points that you basically make mistakes for. So in this case you have 4 points, so you can at max make 4 mistakes. Okay, and it's almost probably impossible here to make all the 4 mistakes, but here you can make, the best is you can make 3 mistakes here. Okay, and this is the error surface. So from here what I want you to know is that there is a function which, so there are 2 underlying functions. One function is approximative function, the function that you want to learn. So in this case that is an OR function, or in that OR function you get this input, you have this f of x. Okay, the other function that once you have this f of x, here you have somehow chose the value of W0, W1, W2. So you got this f of x. Now you're checking the output. So this is your approximating function. The other function which will tell you how good is this approximation, that will be told by this E of W0, E of basically parameters. So I can say, let's say, let me write some variable, E of W. So this is the function of W. It takes W as an input and it tells you what is the error, how better is the function. And this function can also be plotted on this screen. So here you can clearly see that if we have this W1 and W2, I plotted this in, I made a 3D graph in which the height was telling me the error, and sometimes you can only have one variable where you can vary, and you can also plot that, and you want to find the minimum value. So minimum value is somewhere over here. Okay, somewhat over here. Okay, I hope you understand this. So how many of you understood now this error surfaces? So what I said is we have this approximating function, so in which you will get input and you somehow learn the values of these learnable parameters, W0, W1, W2, weights and biases. So once you have these values, so you try to give it, your input with these bias and you get an output corresponding. But it's not always possible that you will only have 4 inputs. You'll be having millions and billions of inputs. So for that, you should have a quantifiable metric. You should have a function which will tell you how good you are, or how bad the function is, how good or how bad the approximation is. That's why this error function comes in. So here we had 2 parameters that were learnable. Were actually 3 parameters, but we fixed this W0 for the sake of visualization. We said this is W1 and this is W2. So if I put the value this, if I put, let's suppose, value of 0 and if I put value of 2, so this is the highest error you will get over here. So W1 if given value 0 and W2 if given value 2.0. so this over here, so it has 3 axes, X, Y and Z. So this axis is W1 and this axis is W2 and the height shows you the error. So this is number of errors you are making. That's why I'm saying here the maximum error you can make is 3, the least error possible is 0. So the least error you are making it over here. So the better values are roughly around this. So 2 and maybe 2 and 2 are the values where you can make almost, you will make 0 errors in this case. So okay, 2 functions you'll have to memorize. One is approximating function, the function that you want to learn, and the second function is when you are learning these parameters and weights and biases. So you have to have a way of knowing how good is the approximation. So that is given by this error function. So this surface over here, the surface that you see, is called as error surface. So I clearly mentioned this, that this is not always possible to visualize. This is only possible to visualize if you have like only 1 or 2 parameters that you can adjust. Okay, usually you will have billions and trillions of parameters. If not millions, at least you will have thousands of parameters to adjust. So there you cannot plot this decision, but you still should think mathematically that this is a function actually. And what you are trying to do, I am trying to minimize this function. I am trying to minimize this error function. So this is also called sometimes loss function. You are trying to minimize the loss function. So loss is a function, approximating function is a function. I hope. So now till now what we have seen is, all that we have seen is basically linear separability. So we had this linear separations were there. So we had linearly separable points were there. So we had all these linear separable points. So whenever we saw, we had this linear separable, and for that we had the decision boundary, which was linear decision boundary. So in that, I'll again remind you that we have this Wi xi. So if it is greater than or equal to 0, so we call it a positive class, and then if this is less than 0, we call it a negative class. Okay, so because as I told you, this usually if you have something like this and then if you have a line, it divides the whole space into 2 half spaces. So one is called as positive half space and one is called as negative half space. It depends on this vector, and this W is called as normal vector. So you have W0, W1, W2, W3 till Wn in n dimension. So this is called as normal vector, normal to the plane, which we have seen at length. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Because before understand, now the question is, we were hard coding these values, we were hard coding W0, W1, W3. We should have a mechanism of learning. Okay, we should somehow learn this. So if we can learn this without even hard coding, because otherwise it becomes pointless. If we have to hard code values W0, W1 and W2, it becomes pointless. Then it is almost like that binary McCulloch-Pitts neurons, where we're taking binary values and giving the threshold by hand. So here what we should do is, we should somehow learn these we should somehow learn these vectors, so that we learn this hyperplane, or we learn this line or plane, or maybe hyperplane in higher dimension. Okay, I would like to show you this example again, so that you are reminded of the thing, that you are reminded at least of this plane concept of these planes and stuff. Okay, let me again go back to code and show you that. If you see this over here, so what I'm doing is, I'm on purpose I'm generating 50 points which are linearly separable. Okay, and then what I'm doing is, I am fixing this W0, W1 and W2 so as to show you this, and then I'm also plotting this normal vector over here also, and decision boundary is also plotted, and you will see normal vector is also plotted. So if I show you the plot, so if I just run it, so you can clearly see over here, so this over here is the data which is linearly separable. Okay, and here this is the vector, and here we have, this is a positive class and this is a negative class. So you can clearly see that the whole space has been divided into 2 half spaces. One is as positive half space and one is negative half space. So you should be clear till here. Okay, because I'll use this to come up with an algorithm. So I should be coming up with an algorithm so that I can learn this. Okay, I will have to do something so that we come up with an algorithm. The first, I'll give you some minutes to think. So what do you think? How can we learn this thing automatically? We can come up with an algorithm which can make it learn. So now we wanted to learn how to make a perceptron learn. This is our question. So what I said is the data is linearly separable here, because we know the perceptron can only learn to separate the data, or it can only do the good classification when the data is linearly separable. So let's consider this example. So you have these data points and you have these red classes. Okay, you can clearly see this data is linearly separable. So this would have been a classifier, or this would have been a boundary. This boundary over here, decision boundary, would have been the boundary which will classify them perfectly. So if you draw, let's suppose, a vector which we call as normal vector. So normal vector will be something of this sort. So this is my normal vector. So what is normal vector? It is basically W vector. So W is W0, W1, W2, and so on, something of this sort. Okay. Now what you have to do is, if you observe this, so if you observe the angle between this point and this point, angle between this point and this point, so basically the angle between the normal and the points on, let's suppose, positive half space. So you will see that the angle between the positive points and the normal is less than 90. You will see it's less than 90 degrees. Similarly, if you make the observation for this, so angle between the normal vector and these points and these negative points, so this is always greater than 90. So this is the observation that you have to do. Okay. Now once you observe this thing, so the second point is, we will randomly initialize this. We will randomly initialize the weights. Okay. So for positive points, the angle is greater than 90 and less than 90. So for negative points, the angle is greater than 90. So this is the observation. So algorithm should go like this. The first step in the algorithm is that you should randomly initialize this weight vector, so that you, let's suppose, got something of this sort. Say we got something of this sort. Now the normal vector is somewhat like this. Okay. Now clearly you can see that these things are well classified. These are misclassified. This is misclassified. This is also well classified. So my job is over here. So my job right now here is, so this, if you see the angle between here, this is less than 90, but I want it to be greater than 90. Okay. So now if I formalize it mathematically, so the actual thing should have been, so if I write it this W1 x1, I should start from W0 x0 plus W2 x2 and so on. Shit is greater than or equal to 0. This is the positive point. Okay. Or in short, I can write summation of Wi xi. I goes from 0 to n. This should be greater or equal to 0. This is a positive point. So I can use the linear algebra. So I can just use it a dot product. So I can write W transpose of x. So here W is a vector, which something of this W0, W1, W2, and so on. And this x is x0, x1 till xn. Okay. So if I transpose this, I can perform the dot product. So this will be like this. So I want this to be greater or equal to 0. So this is for the positive class, and similarly for negative class, I want this. So this is my correct classification. This is correct. Okay. If something is a positive point, I should get this over there, and if some point is a negative point, I should get this over there. So in this, so now if I am randomly initializing initially, so I am giving some random weights. So for a point which is misclassified, there are two possibilities. So I can get W transpose of x is greater or equal to 0 when a point is negative. The actual point was negative. Actual point was a negative class point. It was a negative point. So in this case, somehow in this case, I should decrease the value. Okay, because I am getting positive value, I should get it less than value. So that what can I do is, I'll have to subtract something over here. I'll have to subtract. That's also justified by the angle. Okay, so if you see the angle, we can justify it from the angle as well. Okay. Similarly, if I have W transpose dot x is less than 0, but this point actually was a positive point. So in actual, this point was a positive point. So these two are my errors. So now I have to do something so as to adjust this error. So I should add something to it. So I should add something to W. Okay, something should be added to this W. Something should be added to this W. Here something should be subtracted to W. So add subtracted to W, subtract something, W minus something, and here I should add W plus something. So why am I adding or subtracting something? Because I have to adjust the angle. So when I subtract this thing, so when I subtract, let's suppose if this was W, okay, and the point was over here. Now you can see if it's a misclassified point, I am showing you the geometrical interpretation. If this was a misclassified point, so now this is an obtuse angle. Let's suppose here it's greater than 90. But let's suppose this point, let me write this as blue point. So this blue point was, let's suppose, positive class point. So this should have been less than 90. So what I should do is, I should shift this vector. I should shift this W somewhere over here. Okay. So at this angle, the updated angle, basically, it should become less than 90. And how can I make it less than 90? I should somehow subtract something, because I was getting W transpose x was actually, the actual point was positive point. I was getting W transpose x is less than, this was my prediction. This is the prediction, and this was the actual thing. Then what I should do is, I should add something to W so as to make the vector shift. Okay, so I am shifting vector from here to here. Okay, similarly in this case, if I had a point in which I had, let's suppose this was a negative point and this was, let's suppose, my normal vector. So the normal vector was something of this sort. Okay, so this angle over here, okay, if you see, this is less than 90 angle. So what I should do is I should subtract something from the angle, so that I take this w vector away. So this is new w, this is w new, so this is w old. So here this was w old and this is w new. So I am shifting this vector over here. How can I shift? So this is the second key. This is the case when the point actually was a negative point, but when I predicted it, it was telling me it's a positive way, it was making the error. So what I am doing is I have to subtract something from this w, so that I take w new away, so I can make this angle as an obtuse angle. I can make this angle greater than 90. So this was predicted 90. This was the actual value. It should be greater than 90, and this is what was predicted. Okay, now the algorithm becomes like this. So in algorithm, so if I write the algorithm over here now, so algorithm should be of this sort. So initially what you can do is you randomly initialize vector w. Okay, everybody with me so far? So what you can do is you can randomly initialize this vector. Okay, so what you will get out of this, so when you randomly initialize this vector, so what you have to do is you then have to adjust. Okay, you have to loop through all the points, because at the points that you will have, you have to loop through them. So once you loop through all of these points, you have to make adjustments. So what should it be? So because you will get input, what will be the input of the algorithm? So I should also write input. So input will be points from positive class and points from negative class. This will be your input. So P, these are the inputs which have label 1, and N is the inputs which have label 0. Depends if you call it -1 or +1, that's also fine. So then what you do is you randomly initialize this w, and you also can initialize bias as well. So in here I'll say, let's say bias is fixed, and then what you can see is while not converged. By convergence I mean that you are not getting the lowest error. So you pick up a random point. So okay, you sample a random point x which belongs to P union N. Okay, so this is our input. Inputs can be a positive point or a negative point. You pick up this point. If this x belongs to positive, if this is a positive point, okay, and then you have a condition, and this w transpose x, that means dot product is, let's suppose, less than 0, because we wanted it greater than 0. Then what should you do? You should update this w. Okay, if in second case, if x belongs to negative points and this w transpose dot x, this is greater or equal to 0, greater than 0. So you should again update this. Okay, I justified. Why should you update? I justified it by using the angle, because you have to brought it angle, and then it will converge. So how many of you understood the algorithm? So these are inputs, and at the end the output will be w star. So this w star is which linearly separate, and assumption here is data is linearly separable. Okay, I'll again go through the algorithm and then I'll take the question. First, you have a set of points. You have points P and you have points N. P are the positive points. You have input label, that is 1, and in negative points, your input label, that is 0. The first step in the algorithm is you initialize this weight vector randomly. That is, you take any weight vector. And while it is not converged, so what can you do? Okay, I should rather put everything under while. Okay, so this is under while, so that it becomes like Python code. Okay, so this, if it is not converged, by convergence I mean that the values, it should not give the errors anymore. So you have this x. So x should be taken randomly from P union N, that is positive or negative point. If it is a positive point and you have misclassified it, okay, if it is a positive point and you have misclassified it, then you should adjust the weight vector. So how should you adjust it? Because we had the earlier discussion that the angle basically was, this angle should have been, if it was a positive point, the angle should be less than 90, but it was greater than 90. If you have to make it less than 90, you have to somehow change the value of the value. You have to add something on that. And similarly, if this is the negative point, okay, and the prediction says that it is a positive point, you are making an error. Okay, negative point, the angle should have been greater than 90, but the angle here says that this is actually less than 90. So here you have to make it more than 90. You have to update this vector. Okay, so this is the algorithm. So if you keep on doing this, so what will happen is you will get some optimal W, where it will no more converge. Okay, it will say that all the points are rightly classified. There is no misclassification. Under the assumption that the data is linearly separable. I'll take questions now. Yes. So because of my shortcomings of not making diagrams better, I'll write some code which will show you the diagram that we explained over here. So this is the diagram. So you can clearly see over here. Give me a second. Yes. Now you can see it. So what I did, I wrote some code. So this code was already written in my notebook. So I generated some data points which I already generated, and then I also generated the angles between them. So you can clearly see over here. So this, wherever you get, I'm now mislabeling them as class 0, class 1. So you can see, because wherever you have this vector, the direction of the vector is the positive class. So this usually is the positive class. This red class is positive class, and this is the negative class. Okay, so if I show you with this, so here, so the vectors is this W vector is here. So this vector W. So if you see the angles between these, so these are the points, positive class points, these red points are the positive class points. Okay, so you see the angle between these points is less than 90. Okay, this is less than 90, and the angle between the points which are on the other side, by that's basically opposed to the normal. Okay, they have angle greater than 90. Okay, so what Mahmood was mentioning is, if some line is something in a way such that if all the angles are wrong, okay, it is, let's suppose, outside this, something of this sort, let's suppose, and that W is over here, so it makes every angle is obtuse angle. So what I said is, by using this Perceptron learning algorithm, you should somewhat get this line. If the algorithm is learning correctly, if we have the proof of convergence, if we are guaranteed that this algorithm will converge, okay, it should somehow give us roughly a line of this sort. The second question was, which was given by us, that if these points are they are jumbled in such a way there is very thin line between them. Okay, let's suppose points are somewhat like this. Okay, these are one class points, and this is another class point, and there is a very less margin of finding the line. So if this algorithm is right, and if we have the proof of convergence, then what I'm saying is, so you should have a line of this sort. We should almost classify it like this. Okay, so this is because we have this algorithm and we have its proof of convergence, so it should somehow converge. But in this case, it will probably take more iterations. It will not just take less iterations. But in this data, if we have data which is quite well separated already, okay, then it should take less iterations. It should take less computational power. Is it clear? So let's code this algorithm step by step. Whatever we study in theory, we'll see if it works. Okay, so I'll have to show you all the steps involved in there, and you will use the same algorithm. It's not that difficult to code. So now what we'll do is, so initially I'll just copy paste the code. So here the first part will be generating the data. So this is linearly separable data that I'll generate. Okay, I'll gloss through the code because I understand that you are very well versed with the code. Now this is the generator function which will generate data which is linearly separable. Okay, this makes sure of that. And then we will plot. So in between, because each time I want to plot, so because it will have multiple iterations and I want to plot it in each of the iteration. Okay, then I have a code over here which will plot in each iteration. Not difficult code because we have done enough matplotlib, enough of all of this. So this is quite easy code to understand. So you should, when you are watching this lecture, please do pause it to understand this code thoroughly. The first is generate some complex linearly separable data. Okay, but it still should be linearly separable. And the second thing is we are plotting this data, and we are plotting it each step. The plotting is not done only once. So but this is done maybe in each of the iterations. And then what I can do is I'll code this algorithm. So this is the algorithm, the main algorithm that we have studied so far. Okay, I'll explain this algorithm. So this is what we have studied. So initialize with the random. These are the random W vectors, random vectors. Okay, and then what we have is step is 0. The step count. Okay, then you are plotting at the step. You are plotting step 0. Okay, you are plotting at this point. What was the value of W? Okay, this is the plot that we have. And then we are saying that go to these maximum iterations. Whatever the maximum iterations you are given, can you go to 100,000 iterations? So you see, put this misclassified as false. So put this indicator, the misclassified is false. So then go through all these permutations and np random and go through this length of x. So what you can do is, and you put this xi is equal to this point because this is your point x, this is your labels corresponding, and you make a prediction based on if np dot, you make a dot product if that is greater than 0. Okay, and you have to do if this is greater than 0 or else 0, you put prediction is equal to 1. If wxi is 1 is greater than 0, else you put the prediction equal to 0. Okay, so this is what you are doing. You are taking this point x one by one and its corresponding label also. So what you are saying is, you are saying prediction is 1 if the dot product is greater than or equal to 0. That's what we have studied. So it is a positive class, otherwise it's a negative class. Okay, if the prediction and the label is not correct, okay, then what you should do is you should do this change. Okay, this is the change that you should do. Okay, w plus is equal to yi minus 1. So this minus 1 and this thing is added over in order to make sure that you are either subtracting or adding things on it, and then multiplied by the xi. Okay, so this thing make sure of that. Okay, and then you add this step. And again you plot it, and then you say misclassify it true. So you misclassify it. Okay, because in the iteration you are saying this, you are keeping this. And then if not misclassified, if nothing was misclassified, if no point was misclassified, that's basically convergence. So this is convergence, and then you have to break out of the loop. There are two things. So why are you keeping this misclassified variable? So as to come out of the loop, because you know that if it is converged, the algorithm that I wrote, I said if converged, then you should not run it anymore. And for that, I am creating this indicator variable. So in that, I am saying if misclassified is false, it is not becoming true in this. That means everything is well classified. So you should break the loop. You should come out with this W. So this is my W star. Okay, this is my optimal W. So otherwise, what am I doing is, so I am doing this. So I am initially predicting. So NP dot is, this is the dot product of W and Xi. So if it is greater than or equal to 0, prediction is 1. If it is less than 0, prediction is 0. And then I am saying if label is not equal to prediction, okay, then accordingly adjust this W. Okay, now let's suppose I'll run this. Is the algorithm clear? Is it clear? I hope this should be clear. Pretty easy because we learned every theory, and you know Python, you know Matplotlib, you know everything. So I don't need to spend much time on this again. Now what I should do is I will generate the data first, and based on that what I can do is I can run this algorithm and plot it. Okay, if I press Ctrl V, so here you should see something. Okay, so this is step 1. This is step 0. Step 0 you saw, like this was very good linearly separable data. Okay, clearly linearly separable. Now it made a misclassification. Okay, misclassification here, and then it went to step 0. So W over here was 0.67, 0.36, 0.81. So this was the initial W, the random W. And then once you had this, so this was the decision boundary that we were getting. So you were having misclassification. So still again the loop will run. Okay, so this was step 1. W was changed, minus 1.67, 2.03 and 1.4, and W0, W1 and W2. Okay, again there were probably some misclass over here. Okay, again in step 2. So you see, mess it up again, it messed up. And slowly if you see here, you can see the perfect, and it stopped. In each step it showed, it took us only 4 steps. So in the 4th step, it exactly distributed the data. It made a decision boundary which is perfectly classifying the data. Okay, and this is W0, W1 and W2. These are the optimal Ws. And if I run it again, because this is random, so you can see these values can be different, because there can be a lot of possible Ws that will perfectly classify this data. So if I run this again, okay, this is 0.33, 2.79, 4.29, 4.29. Okay, if I run it again, you should see that different values should be there. Okay, it is somehow getting the same value. Maybe I have added seed or something, but if you keep on running this, so in step 3, this is classifying it. Okay, so how many of you understood the algorithm now? For how many of you can I assume that you have understood this algorithm perfectly? So here I showed you a real world example in which we had linearly separable data. We generate the data, and then we could sort of find the values of these W0, W1 and W2, in which we had the W is the normal vector that we had. So in this case, W0 was the bias that I think Mahmoud pointed out. And one more question that we received is that, can we adapt this? Can we somehow, if we have multiple classes, okay, if I turn this off, so can we, if we have multiple classes, so if we have these multiple classes, so now this works on binary classes. So if you have 2 classes, so how can we adapt this to do the multi-class classification? So what I said is, so there's a technique which is called as one versus all. Okay, so in this, let's suppose you have 10 classes. So when you have 10 classes, so you have, let's suppose, from 1 to till 10. So in the initial step, what can you do is you can use this binary classifier to say 1 versus 2 to 10. So you can say from this 2 to 10, I'll consider this as one class, and I'll consider this one as separate class. So I'll do the classification based on this. So once whole of this one is classified, one is separated from others. So I can repeat the process on these. I can say 2 versus 3 to 10. Okay. So once this is also separated, I can say this 3 versus 4 to 10. Okay. I can keep on doing this. Okay. I am doing it in multi levels. Okay. So that's how I can adapt this binary classifier to do the multi classification. So binary classifier can be adapted to do multi-class classification. Multi-class classification. By using this one versus all. This was the question that we received, and this is the answer to that. Now the question in this case, so this was just a side note. Now the question in this case was this. So if you have this Perceptron learning algorithm, okay, in which we were adjusting these W's, we're adjusting the W vector so as to get it to the W star vector, which perfectly, if the data is linearly separable, which perfectly then separates out 2 classes. Now the question is something like this. So what is the proof that this does not toggle forever? So what is the meaning of that? Let's suppose one point is something of this sort, and another point is like this. So this point tells, let's suppose this is the linear separate boundary, and there is some misclassification, so there will be some misclassification. Okay, and there is some right classifications also, something of this sort. I'm just keeping it so that maybe I'll put it something of this sort so that it is linearly classified still. Okay, so let's suppose to take this example. Okay, if this example is misclassified, say W vector is something of this sort, or in this case W vector is something like this. So if you randomly sample, you take this point and it asks W vector, okay, you should shift towards this. Okay, and then if you take some other point, say this point, this is again misclassified, say this is misclassified. So it can bring this vector, updated vector again to this. Okay, it can keep on toggling. So if you take one point, it will bring it to the right direction. If you take another point, it can bring it to left direction. So what is the proof that this will not happen? So this is not desirable even. This is not desirable. Why is it not desirable? Because otherwise it will not converge. Okay, so if the data is linearly separable, so now there should be some mathematical way of proving this. Okay, this perceptron learning algorithm will always converge. Okay, so first we will formulate the mathematical problem. So we'll formulate the problem and then we'll have to give the proof. So this is the technique that I'll teach you. So in today's class we'll learn how to come up from this. You have the thinking, you have the problem right now, and you will have to model it mathematically. Okay, the question is this, which I described like with hand wavy arguments. I said if you have data of this sort, so if one point of the data it updates W, and other point undoes that, it undoes the update. Okay, so whatever updation was done in the previous step, so current step, let's suppose, undoes that update. So if it undoes, so it looks that it might keep on toggling. So there should be some proof that this perceptron learning algorithm will always converge. So there should be a proof that this should always converge. So how many of you understood the problem? So this is the problem. Okay, so you understood the problem. So you now agree that there can be this problem, that one point can take it to the right, other point can bring it back to the left. So this can happen, keep on happening. Then there should be some proof which could tell us mathematically, okay, so that this algorithm will always converge. So now first thing is we have to somehow formulate the problem. Okay, what should we mathematically prove? I know, okay, this is what is the problem. Then I'll have to come up with a mathematical thinking which will tell me, okay, this is how you have to model the problem, and now based on this modeling you will have to prove this. So I'll have to set up some premise. Okay, so now how to formulate the problem. So I'll teach you how to formulate such problems. Now the theorem should go like this. So the first thing you should state that I have two finite sets. So the point should be finite. Okay, otherwise infinite points, then you will be in trouble. Okay, so finite points can be positive or negative. So I can have positive points and I can have negative points, and then they can belong to Rn. They can be Rn. So you have positive class points and you have and these negative class points. So they can belong to n-dimensional space, but they should be linearly separable. Linearly separable. Okay, I'm trying to first formulate the problem that we have. Okay, then the perceptron learning algorithm. Okay, it should converge. So that means you should get a W. What's the meaning of convergence? So convergence basically means you should get say W star. So for W star or W star dot X is greater than 0 for all X belongs to positive class. Okay, W star X is less than 0 for all X belongs to negative class. So this is convergence. So I should find such a W. So this is convergence. So assumption is this. So this is linearly separable. Okay, how many of you understood the formulation? So what I said is initially we should have a finite point, that is positive points and negative points, and they should be n-dimensional points, and these points should be linearly separable. So what is the meaning of convergence then? The meaning of convergence is this. I should have W star. Okay, which should give me this. And one more thing that's very important. So this should happen in finite steps. Finite steps. Let's suppose this should happen within t steps. So t is some finite number. T is finite. So this is how you should formulate the problem. You should know how to formulate problem. Now once I pinned it down mathematically, now this is the thing I have to prove. Okay, I have to prove this mathematically. So I told you something verbally. I told you, okay, what is the proof that perceptron learning algorithm will converge? Okay, what's the proof for that? So in order to put it mathematically, I wrote clearly the assumptions, I wrote everything clearly. So first thing I wrote is there are finite points which are either from positive class or from the negative class. Okay, and these points are n-dimensional and they are linearly separable. Okay, if I have to say that this converges, so what's the meaning of that? I'll find such a W star, I'll find such a W vector, this normal vector, such that if I take any point from positive class, then the dot product should be greater than or equal to 0. If I take any point from negative class, then the dot product should be less than 0. And this I should get in finite steps. And finite steps t should be finite. Okay, it should not be infinite. So this is the formulation of the problem. So this is formulation, and then we'll have to prove this. So you'll have to prove. Okay, and maybe in the subsequent section we'll prove this. So how many of you understood the formulation? Okay, the essence of this problem is that the first thing is you should learn to bring the real world problem into the mathematical problem. Okay, you should somehow formulate the problem. This is a very important skill, that you have a real world problem, you can formulate it, you can model the problem. So the first step was that. So you took a problem. So in this case, you have the Perceptron Learning Algorithm, and I gave you some verbose argument that this Perceptron Learning Algorithm should always converge. So then I have to bring it to the mathematical world. Okay, this is how I brought this into the mathematical world. So I somehow wrote down some mathematics, and then I can use algebra and everything on this. Okay, once I have this in the mathematical world, so next step is to bring it in the computational world. So what's the computational world? That basically is, you should somehow tell me the ways of computation. What things can I do so as to compute this? Okay, once you have the mathematics pinned down, and then you bring it to the computation, and after that you have to create an algorithm to solve it, because you have to have a stepwise procedure of solving it. So that is bringing a real world problem into a computational world problem, into a mathematical, then into a computational world, and then into an algorithm. Okay, once you have the algorithm, and the next steps basically are, you can optimize, you can make it more efficient, you can make it resource efficient, time efficient, and things like that. And as I cannot emphasize enough, this is a very important skill to have. Okay, this is what is the differentiating factor between a person who has the real understanding of the subject and the person who is just intelligent, who can be thought as intelligent. Okay, to mathematically model these. As I was giving you the example, that if you are learning calculus, so one way is that somebody is teaching you calculus. So he is giving you the mathematical model itself. He is just teaching you maths, but there is a missing link in between. So how did people come up from this? They took the real world example and they brought it into mathematics. Okay, they somehow modeled the problem. That's a missing link which students are not taught in schools. Okay, from these sessions, I want you to ensure, and I want you to practice enough so that you can take a real world problem, can convert that into mathematical problem, and from mathematical you can take that into computational world, and from the computation you can come up with the algorithm and then optimize it. So with this, I'll stop the recording.